Welcome to Chapter 1, entitled Times of Change. Now, as we go throughout this chapter, we're going to be working towards our understanding of how changing societal structures can affect a society's worldview. In other words, how does the way that society is structured affect the worldview of the people within that society? Now, we'll go about developing our understanding of this topic by understanding how the structure of society, and in this case, feudalism in the Middle Ages, how it helped to shape people's worldview. We'll look at how disease, and specifically the Black Death, and religion, and more specifically the Catholic religion during the Middle Ages, how it affected the worldview of that time. We'll also understand how the feudal system developed attitudes that guided medieval society, and start to examine how feudalism began to decline and fall apart, and as a result, the middle class began to change the structure of society during the Middle Ages and as European transitioned into the Renaissance. Now, as we go through this chapter, we need to see it as a road through some of the ideas towards the Renaissance. If we look in the rearview mirror, you'll see the Middle Ages. And we'll look at how the people lived during the Middle Ages and how the Black Death resulted in massive changes towards European society. We'll look at the impact that the Black Death had on the values and the beliefs of the people that survived. We're working towards addressing the question, in what ways did European society change because of the Black Death? So as I read you the introductory story to this chapter, I want you to consider how the Black Death changed people's worldview, and based on what you know about disease, how would it potentially affect the worldview elements, value, society, as well as beliefs. It takes place in 1347. A ship arrives in the Messina city, the island of Sicily, off the coast of Italy. The ship sailed into the busy harbor. It had come from the ports of the eastern Mediterranean, where it took cargo of spices and other goods. When the ship landed, the dock workers were surprised to see the 6 sailors staggering onto the shore. Everywhere on the deck of the ship was laying dead or dying sailors. They had black and purplish blots on their skin and strange egg-shaped swellings in their armpits. The dying were coughing, moaning, and vomiting blood. In a few days, most of the sailors were dead. People who cared for them also developed some of the same terrible symptoms. Soon, people all over the city began to fall ill and die. The disease that sailors had brought was called the Black Death or bubonic plague. They had caught it in the eastern seaports that they had visited. The Black Death was spread by fleas on the rats that lived in the urban areas and on board ships. There was no cure for the disease, and over the next 2 years it spread all over Europe. About 1/3 to 1/2 of the people in Europe, approximately 25 million people, eventually died as a result of the Black Death. Some villages and towns were completely wiped out. Now, very quickly, here are a few fast facts regarding the bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, before we discuss the elements of worldview that it has impacted. Now, first of all, it began in the late 1300s in the Gobi Desert between China and Mongolia. Remember, in class, we actually identified where in the world that was. It was mainly transmitted through flea bites and saliva droplets. Fleas and rats were the hosts for the disease, many of which lived on the boats that brought back goods from Asia. Over a 5-year period, almost 1/3 to half of the population of Europeans died as a result of the Black Death. Now, the bubonic plague was the most common form of the Black Death, where victims would have symptoms like high fever, nausea, vomiting, and aching joints. The disease was so deadly because they would lay dormant and people would not show these symptoms but would have and be carrying the disease for up to a week to 10 days. Once they started to show these symptoms, they would only live for about 3 to 4 days. The mortality rate, meaning the number of people that died because of the disease, was 90 to 95%. Now, with today's modern medicine, only 5 to 10% of people who would get the Black Death or bubonic plague would lose their life. So many people died that they didn't have room to bury people, so they had to have large trenches to be dug for mass burials. Now, the Black Death and the bubonic plague didn't just happen once, but there were several waves of the bubonic plague that happened over several centuries. Now that we have a little bit of information regarding the Black Death, we can maybe start to understand how it changed people's worldview. Now, first of all, it may have impacted people's values because people may possibly value life more with widespread disease and death around them. It could impact society because the structure of society could change as a large population of the common class or peasants, meaning freemen and serfs, died as a result of the plague. And now it could potentially change some people's beliefs, as some people were blaming God for the devastation all around them. And therefore, some historians say that this resulted in some people potentially beginning to question their religious beliefs. Now, as we look at the context of the Black Death today, we wanted to build 2 skills. One, it's how to start to read and gather some information from a map. Now, you can see here, these are the cases of the Black Death in the United States from 1970 to 2012. And this is information from the Center of Disease Control. And as we looked at this map, we considered why are the majority of the cases of the Black Death clustered in the western portion of the United States. And we looked at potentially because the majority of the goods might come in to the country from the western ports. The next skill that we wanted to develop was what kind of conclusions can we derive when looking at a chart. Now this chart, it tells us about the human plague cases and deaths in the United States from 2000 to 2014. Now when we looked at this map, we asked ourselves the question, are there any trends that we see here, or any anomalies or anything different that we can see? And we looked at this spike right here in 2006. And we questioned, why was there so many cases that occurred in 2006 more than the previous years and the years that came after? Now, anything that we came up with was more or less hypothetical because we did not do any in-depth research. But we continued on with understanding how a changing society can impact people's values and attitudes, and therefore result in the way that society is structured or organized. Now, as we start to develop our understanding of how medieval society was structured, we need to develop our proper vocabulary. Now, first of all, we need to understand the word feudalism. Now, feudalism is a system of political organization during the Middle Ages, in which the lord owned all the land and all others served him. Now, the next word that you need to understand is a hierarchy. A hierarchy is a social system in which status is ranked and power is located in the higher ranks. And therefore, a feudal hierarchy is a way of organizing society where people are ranked based on their level of importance, and the people in those higher ranks own a lot more land. The next word that we need to understand is allegiance, because the feudal hierarchy was based on allegiances, which means loyalty. The people at the bottom of the hierarchy needed to be loyal to the people above them, where the people above them had the duty to serve and protect the people below them. Now, because feudalism is based on land ownership, we need to understand that land was also called manors. And a manor was a piece of land, sometimes called a fief. And people would become lords of manors because they would swear oaths of allegiances or loyalty to the crown or the king and queen. Now, the feudal system was built on the backs of peasants. One of these kinds of peasants are called serfs. They were peasants who worked the land for the lords and were not allowed to leave the manor without the lord's permission. They were no more than slaves. Freemen were also peasants and commoners who rented land or worked for pay, and they had a little bit more freedom. As you will see, religious leaders were also very important in feudal society. Therefore, there were monasteries, which are buildings and lands where monks lived. And finally, it is also important to understand what a journeyman is. And it's a person who has learned a trade and joined a guild. This is important because we still use the same process of creating journeymen that they did in the Middle Ages. Now that we've developed some basic vocabulary, we can start to ask the question, how was society structured? Well, now during the Middle Ages, European society was organized into a system called feudalism. Now, feudalism is a hierarchy where people are ranked based on their level of importance. Feudalism is based on land, loyalty, and duty. Therefore, the more land people had, the more important they were. Now, it's important to remember, in this societal structure of feudalism, people were born into the level of society that they were born into and expected to stay there for their whole lives. Now, how were people able to gain land? Well, people like nobles and knights swore an allegiance to the king or the crown that they would fight for him in exchange for land called manors or fiefs. Now in your notes, you're asked to complete this chart, then using pages 18 to 23 in your textbook to describe each of the positions in feudal society, starting with the peasants, including freeholders and serfs, knights, bishops, and finally the crown. Now remember, all of this information came from the textbook in pages 18 to 23. Now, when we start to look at the characteristics of the position of peasants, first of all, we're going to describe just in general what the lives of peasants were like and any rules that would limit or restrict their life or therefore their worldview. And then we'll look at and consider how were freeholders and serfs different. Now, as far as peasants are concerned, peasants lived in the rural village manors. They would be assigned strips of land to plant and harvest. Each peasant family had its own strips of land. Sometimes peasants worked cooperatively with other families on tasks like plowing and haying. In exchange for use of the land, they would pay a portion of what they produced to the lord or noble. This is also known as a tax. They were also responsible for building roads, clearing forests, and other work ordered by the lord. Children worked alongside adult men and women. They were unable to read, they were uneducated, and rarely left the manor. Now in this additional spot, we look at what was the difference between the two types of commoners or peasants. They are freeholders or freemen and serfs. Peasants could either be a freeman or a serf. Freemen or freeholders rented land from the lord or worked for pay. Most peasants were serfs, who were not allowed to leave the manor without the lord's permission. Now it's important to note that 90% of the population was made up of the commoner class and were either freeholders or serfs. The next three levels, which included the knights, then the bishops, and the crown, these were known as nobility and made up of 10% of the population of people, but they controlled the majority of the power and land in feudal societies. Now knights and nobles swore allegiances or oaths of allegiances and loyalty to the king. They promised to fight for him in exchange for rights to pieces of land called manors or fiefs. Additionally, bishops received land from the crown. Now it's important to note that the church became a very large landowner, and as a result, the church was now very important to medieval people's practical lives because they owned lots of land, as well as their spiritual lives because they were the main authority for the religion at that time. And now finally, the crown were the rulers of the whole feudal system. and the crown, therefore, was the main authority and decision maker during the Middle Ages. Please note that there is a section in your notes to recreate the diagram from page 18 in your notes. Now remember that this is a societal structure during the Middle Ages called the feudal hierarchy. Now that we understand how society was structured into a feudal hierarchy, we need to look at and question how nobility and the clergy held all of the land and power in society, yet they only made up 10% of the population. Now in class we asked ourselves a question, why do we think the commoners may have accepted this situation? And it's important to remember that the worldview of peasants was quite narrow, as they had many restrictions on their lives and were very rarely able to leave the manors. Now we ask ourselves, how limited would our worldview be if we were born and never able to leave our classroom? It wouldn't enable us to question very much about what our lives would be like if there was something different. Please remember that as we went through and discussed these things in class, we watched 2 videos that were about 6 to 7 minutes long that described to us what life was like in the medieval towns or urban areas, as well as the manors or the rural areas. As we continued to develop our map reading skills, we looked at this particular map of a medieval manor. And we asked ourselves a question, where are the major manor houses and church located? And what does this location suggest to you? Well, it suggests that the church and the manors were central parts of rural life. Now, the next thing that we wanted to do was consider 2 different points of view regarding the manorial system. And we did so by looking at 2 samples of pieces of writing from that time. Now we considered the 2 different viewpoints that the authors were presenting, and if they were either highlighting the positive or negative aspects of manorial life, as well as the criteria that the writer used to judge the manorial system. Now from viewpoint 1, it focused on the negative details because of the lack of extreme poverty, the lack of freedom, repression, and exploiting people. Where the second viewpoint focused on the positive details, looking at a resulting agricultural boom, the clearing and development of land, as well as establishing new towns and an increase of population. Now the criteria that the first viewpoint used was an emotional approach by focusing on the repression, poverty, and exploitation of people. Where the second viewpoint used facts by focusing on how things like by 1300 the population of Europe had risen from roughly 40 million to 100 million people. We looked at and considered that no matter what historical context or events we look at, we can always consider multiple viewpoints, and we should in order to get a well-rounded understanding of the historical event. Okay, now that we have an understanding of a couple of different viewpoints of town and country life, or medieval rural and urban life, you are asked to create a Venn diagram using the information on pages 19 and 22 and 23. This, hopefully you were able to complete a list of advantages and disadvantages, as well as similarities and differences between urban and rural life. Remember, in class we discussed that the hardest part about this activity is going to be completing that similarities portion, as there are sections in the textbook entitled Country Life as well as Town Life, but there wouldn't be a section entitled the similarities and similarities between town and country life. And therefore, you would have to draw on the knowledge from both of those 2 sections and start to draw some similarities between the information in both those sections. I've included a PDF copy of this document on the homework board as well. Now, some of the things that we need to consider first about town life is that there were some advantages. Now, the first one that I had listed was that they had freedom to marry whomever that they wanted, and they could make as much money as they could. Additionally, the productions of good and trade were organized by co-op groups called guilds. They controlled prices, quality standards, and admitted apprentices. Unlike unskilled peasants could open shops, and many would learn trades. Many would eventually become masters, and the steps were you would become an apprentice and train in a craft. You would then become a journeyman who passes an examination and becomes part of a guild, also known as a modern-day union. And masters could open their own businesses and take on apprentices. Now remember that this is the exact same way that people develop trades today, like machinists, mechanics, or electricians. And also, by law, many serfs could regain their freedom by staying in town for a year and a day without being discovered. Now, the only disadvantage that I included as living in a part of a medieval town or urban life was that towns were crowded, dirty, and rat-infested places. When it came to country life, some of the advantages that I identified were that peasants were given their own strips of land. They could work alongside of their own families. Some people may include this as a disadvantage. Some of the disadvantages were portions of their crops had to be given to the lords of the manor, and serfs had very little or no freedom to leave the manor or become educated and learn a trade. Now that middle portion, which may be a little bit difficult, which highlights the similarities between rural and urban life during the Middle Ages, well, there was a central focus on farming and agriculture, because all of the rural manors were all about producing in the fields. Now, all of the access that was used to be able to be sold was brought into the urban areas and into the markets to be sold. Now, children began working at a young age in both the towns and in the countries. In the countries, children worked alongside the adults in the fields, and in the towns, children would learn a trade. Additionally, guilds, like serf families, worked in cooperation with each other. Guilds took care of each other's families, and in cases of illness, serf families worked together on tasks. Peasants in town could open shops, and freemen on manors could rent or earn a wage. Now remember that I also included this document as a hard copy document in a couple places on the homework board. And now that we have an understanding of how medieval society was structured into a feudal hierarchy and what life was like in urban and rural areas during the Middle Ages, we can start to consider how did feudalism begin to decline? And what were those events and things that led to the failure of the feudal system in medieval Europe? And in order to display your understanding of the decline of feudalism, you were asked to create a timeline of events using pages 24 to 26 in your textbook that shows the decline of feudalism. Now remember that we did an in-class activity that took 2 or 3 days where you guys needed to come up with either a short play, individual actions, or boomerangs or images to represent each of these 7 events and things that led to the decline of feudalism. Now here are a couple of examples of digital assignments that you students have submitted. The next thing that you are asked to do in your notes is using the information, and specifically this chart in page 26, along with the challenges to feudalism timeline, in order to understand the causes of the Black Death, and now using this chart to understand the effects of the Black Death. We're really focusing on the lives of freemen and serfs in this activity. The most important thing is to look at the data that you're given in this chart. Most importantly, how the expenses of running a medieval manor increased. So now, as a result of this chart, what were those effects? Well, for the lives of serfs, a large percentage of the serfs died or left the manors to find higher paying work. Serfs who remained on the manors would have to work harder and longer hours to make up for these massive labor shortages. Now, manors that went bankrupt put many serfs off their strips of land. Some manors rented or sold land to serfs and released the serfs from their obligations to the lords. Freemen were now, as a result, able to demand higher wages. And as we can see from the chart on page 26, where before the Black Death, to hire 80 additional workers at 300 days at a penny per day, it cost about 2,400 pennies. And as a result of the Black Death, those same workers were able to demand 3 pennies a day, which increased the cost of running a manor to 72,000 pennies per year. And now we know what the effects were of the Black Death, we can ask ourselves the question, why do we think these freemen were able to demand more money for their labor during the Black Death? And as we discussed, we found that the answer was quite simple. Well, they were asked to do 3 times the amount of work, and therefore they should have been able to demand 3 times the wages. Probably the most important change to people's worldview as a result of the Black Death is how people started to view time as well as money. Now, as towns grew and life on the manors changed, money came into use more and more, and as a result, people began to think of time differently. Now, what were people's activities and lives based on while living on the medieval manors? Well, the medieval manors, people's activities had been ruled by the rising and settings of the sun and the changings of the seasons. Therefore, people were using seasonal time to manage their lives. And then we needed to consider which members of medieval society thought that knowing the exact time was important, and explain why knowing the exact time was important. Well, knowing what the exact time was important for church members because they needed to know when it was time to pray. And as a result, we're starting to see how people manage time is starting to change. How it went from using seasonal time to how people started to keep track during the medieval period using mechanical time with devices such as sundials, water clocks, and hourglasses. And these mechanical time devices were developed for people like shopkeepers and merchants and businessmen in the towns because people were dependent on time to manage their businesses. Clocks were built to include bells in order to call people to worship. Now, with a lot more freedom in society, people began to develop a lot more wealth. And with the rise of towns, society became less rigid, which meant that people began to have some sort of social mobility, which meant that they can move from class to class by acquiring wealth and skills, especially in the towns and cities. Urban people had some opportunity to move up from one social level to another, and a new social structure began to emerge. So now, as the new societal structure began to emerge, we understand that with this new middle class, power was now based on money rather than land ownership like it was in the feudal hierarchy. Now, as a result, people began to display their wealth in different ways, and they did so with the clothing that they wore, the furniture and decorations in their home, as well as the meals that they served. Now, one factor that started to lead to the expansion of trade outside of Europe was that people were starting to desire more luxury goods like exotic fabrics. But as people started to demand more luxury goods, there were laws that were put in place in order to manage society. An example of one of these laws to manage societies was a sumptuary law. Sumptuary laws were laws that controlled the consumption of goods, or how people spent their money. These laws restricted what types of people could buy what kinds of goods. For example, what kinds of clothing certain classes could actually wear. The next activity that you were asked to complete in your notebook was to compare the new social structure to the feudal hierarchy and understand its similarities and differences. Now, once again, this isn't an area in the textbook where you will see a heading called Similarities and Differences between the feudal structure and the new class structure, which included the middle class. You need to utilize both of these charts and start to draw some conclusions yourself. And we asked ourselves, what was the biggest change to the social structure, and why do you think these changes occurred? Now, the one major change that we need to address is that the middle class was made up of people like businessmen and bankers. This enabled people to develop wealth for the first time in human history, and therefore it enabled people to have social mobility and move from one class to the next. Now, what were some of the other similarities and differences? Well, some of the similarities between the feudal hierarchy and the new social class structure included peasants and laborers, and the unemployed were still at the lowest level of society. The lords of the manors were still in the higher levels of society, where church officials were widely respected. Freemen were now able to charge a higher wage for their work, where noble families were still part of the higher levels of society. Now, how was the feudal hierarchy and this new social structure different? Well, now power in society was based on wealth and money rather than how much land someone owned. People were now able to move from one level of society to another. The top level of society now includes more groups of people rather than just royalty. Church officials are now split into two groups, almost like a hierarchy of their own, which we will discuss that hierarchy later. Serfs could now rent or buy land. They could be set free from their obligations from the lords of the manors rather than just having to run away. Instead of a central focus on a religious life, people began to pursue business and material goods. Freemen were able to charge money for their labor, a higher wage rather, where businessmen became more dependent on mechanical clocks rather than using things like seasonal time. Remember that in class we discussed that mottos represent the drive or the mission of a group of people. And we started to develop some mottos for the middle class that would represent their motivations based on increasing their status in society as well as the amount of wealth that they had as individuals. The final portion or section in this chapter is understanding the religious society and how the religious beliefs helped to shape this society's worldview during the Middle Ages. Now, in order to understand the structure of the religious society during the Middle Ages, we need to consider how people dealt with problems like the Black Death in today's society versus during the Middle Ages. Now, science and medicine are used now in order to find a cure, and we use common tools to prevent the spread of disease. However, this process was different during the Renaissance because no one knew exactly what to do, and as a result, many people began to see these problems as a punishment from God. And therefore, it's important to understand that a central people of people's daily lives during the Middle Ages was their religious beliefs. Now, it's important to understand that the Western worldview of Europe was shaped by the Christian Church. Now, life in medieval times was tough. Sickness and famine and the constant threat of war was rampant. The hope for life after death was quite important because it gave people something to look forward to, and they believed it when their church leaders told them that they could make it to heaven and would be repaid for their faith in the afterlife. Now, as we know, during the Middle Ages, people viewed the world through hierarchies, and the church was no different. The church had a hierarchy of its own. And we can look at similarities between the church hierarchy and how it was similar to that of feudalism. Now, first, people had to be obedient to the group above them. So, for example, priests performed service for parishioners such as baptism and marriages, where peasants worked for the lords of the manors as well as barons who owned land on behalf of the church. Members of the church had the duty to obey the rules set by the church and respect the priest's authority and pay tithes. This is similar to how peasants paid a portion of their crop to the lords of the manor in forms of taxes. Now, third, belonging to the church, like living on a rural manor, gave people a sense of community. And as the church began to build and become more influential, many churches were built in the Middle Ages, and people took great pride in their local cathedrals. It often became a competition for these bishops to see who could build the tallest and most beautiful buildings. Here you can see a shift away from a spiritual life and more towards a focus on material things. And as the church continued to build, people started to join religious orders. For men, that meant becoming monks and joining monasteries, where women would become nuns and enter the convents. Monastic life was quite similar for most people of that time, spent most of their time studying religious texts, praying and teaching children, and taking care of the sick, as well as feeding the hungry. Many people in the religious orders were taking care of people during the Black Death, and also many of these people lost their lives as a result. Now, it's important to understand that learning in the church was quite different, and unlike most people, nuns and priests were educated and literate, which meant they learned to read and write. Some monasteries became great centers of learning, where religious texts and manuscripts written in Latin Greek helped to encourage the revival of learning in the Renaissance. Eventually, universities began to emerge where people could study subjects like grammar, geometry, astronomy, or music. However, women were not allowed to attend university until the late 1800s. Now, people started to have their attitudes that were changing towards their religious worldview. With the Black Death, people began to question their faith, and with visits to holy sites and other attempts to appease their gods had not worked. People kept dying, and people started to feel like they had been abandoned by their God. And as people began to feel abandoned by their gods, they began to develop a critical attitude towards their church. Throughout the textbook, we can look at 3 different reasons for these attitudes. First, the church was quite wealthy. It owned a third of the land in Europe and was making lots of money from renting the land. It was also collecting tithes and large sums of money from the estates of its wealthy members. Some critics said the clergy, that being the priests and bishops, began to become more interested in a luxurious life and building very large, impressive churches rather than living a spiritual life dedicated to its parishioners. And as a result, society was undoubtedly changing. Towns were becoming busy, and the middle class has made society less rigidly organized. Therefore, meaning there was social mobility. Worldly pleasures became more important, and a great period of creativity was about to begin. That's why the term Renaissance is used to describe the rebirth of classical learning. And as a result of these shifting attitudes towards their religious worldview, people like Martin Luther, Leonardo da Vinci, Vasco da Gama, and Christine de Pizan were now replacing monks and knights as the new stars of the Middle Ages. I really hope that you enjoyed this video lecture, and we will see you for the next video lecture entitled The Expansion of Trade for Chapter 2.